Hello. You ready? Colette says she's going to be a little bit late. Have we heard from Randy?
Randy's online.
Oh, hi, Randy, wherever you are.
Hi, everyone.
Hi. Okay, are we ready? We'll call the meeting to order. Welcome, everyone. This is the Marion City Council special session for April 27, 2022. Proceed.
Hi, thank you, Mayor.
Hello.
Council, hope everybody's well. So just, we're gonna do, we've got the crew here. Michael Maloney, I'll turn it over to him in a little bit. He'll guide us through this presentation. One of the things that we've done is, as part of our preparation, the team is gonna jump in if one person misses something or there's something of value we're gonna add. And we'd ask, obviously, this is your meeting. We'd ask that you do the same. But one thing that I really wanted to share, and as we were prepping for this, I asked the team if we could come up with an analogy, and the best thing that we could come up with was a snow globe. And apologies for the small, Leanne was kind enough to bring 2 snow globes. One played really loud music and it was obnoxious, and we figured this would be better. But basically, this kind of symbolizes what we're going to talk about today. It's going to be really cloudy when we start, but hopefully at the end of the meeting, it's going to be much clearer and everything's going to settle and we'll be able to kind of see clearly. And as we've kind of been thinking through this, really, it's about what are we doing and where is this going to take us and why is this important? And as I put in my email, that at the end of the meeting, what we're going to be asking for is direction on a rate. But we wanted to make sure that we're providing all of this context beforehand, that we're not simply coming in a reactive state with a rate, that there is a strategy, there is a methodology, and there is a long-term goal of how we're evaluating our finances and how we're putting things in place as we go through, not just with the sanitary, I mean, we're talking sanitary today, but this will be kind of a springboard into what we look to be doing with our other funds. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Michael Maloney, who will guide us through. And again, we'll jump in, fill in the color, and if there's questions, please ask as you're going along. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for your time today. I appreciate you received the slides in advance. I'm not going to read off of every bullet, and to echo what Ryan said, we want to make this a little bit interactive today as well. I think before jumping in, the first thing I want to highlight is the importance for municipal governance of utility infrastructure. I think we all recognize that, especially over the last several years. Something that we're talking to a number of the communities, something that the city's already done is something like stormwater, the stormwater utility being its own entity and being another major water utility, stormwater, sewer, and water. But all 3 of those are going to require major investments over the next generation. Marion is no different than other communities facing these challenges. So I appreciate that we're focused on the city today, but I want to give that big picture context before we jump in at this time. Oh, there we go. So where are we going to start out? And I'm going to echo a little bit of Ryan here. This is split into 3 pieces. One, I appreciate we're all coming to this conversation with different levels of comfort and understanding about utility finance and some of the financial metrics. We want to just make sure everyone's on the same page in terms of what we're referencing, not to make assumptions from one place to another, and just give an overview of how that process works in a more global concept. The second phase of what we're going to do is detail a little bit about Ryan said about the long-term perspective and approach. I like to think of any of the models that we put together as sort of a living, breathing document. So if we're bringing you data and analysis at a given time, it is a snapshot of that time. Things will continue to evolve. And that's a universal concept, but specific for today, there's 3 things I'd like to highlight. Staff can jump in here as well. Previously, we've had the HDR engineering study for the utility. And that is going to impact the long-term sustainability and financials of the utility. That's something that's going to need to be implemented over a period of time. And we want to make sure we're thoughtful about that, how that will play going forward. The second item is ongoing dialogue with the city's treatment provider, which is the city of Cedar Rapids. We know that that discussion will continue to evolve and have impact on the overall operations of the system. And then the third piece is, while we're talking specifically about ongoing user rates to the system, I would be remiss if we didn't talk about the need for further discussion about either new connections or changing connections as it relates to developer considerations throughout the community. We're not going to get into the details per se on that today, but it doesn't mean it's not something we won't revisit going forward. And the last piece is that the third section is going to talk about specific action that staff wants to bring to the attention of council for potential action in the near term as it relates to rate setting. So we'll summarize some of those options and considerations for you, but that's the top to bottom approach that we're going to be taking today. A little bit of anchoring for everybody. I think it's important to understand the comparables around the state for a community like your own, though it's not the be all end all. Everyone's situation is unique, all right? That being said, the city of Ames has historically done a nice job of accumulating data for both water and sewer utilities around the state for communities with a population over 10,000. When we get a 2021 report, as I'm referencing here and throughout the presentation, it is being produced in January of 2022 and is backward looking as a result of what rates were for those communities in 2021. Currently, there are 42 such communities over 10,000 population around the state that provide data for this analysis, some of which is summarized within here. I wanted to be clear that the $4 monthly minimum charge that the city has is on the low end of those user rate charges, and we'll provide a little bit of context on that. I think what's most important and what we often focus on would be the typical residential user. From a statewide consideration, that's around 600 cubic feet. And based on that, currently the city's fixed charges are about 13% of the total bill. So want to have that context. I will say, in doing some high level analysis here, we believe the city's average usage for the sewer utility, really how much water is being used that's being billed on, is likely less than the statewide average. I think it's important for us to focus on the bottom third of the slide here, just to give a little extra context for you as we move forward. Over the CIP that you reviewed during the budget process, fiscal 23 through 2027, the sanitary sewer capital projects comprise approximately 36% of the city's overall CIP. So of all entities, all elements, more than a third of that is related to sanitary sewer. That being said, in last year's audited financials, fiscal 21, sewer revenues comprised only 8% of total city revenues. So we can see that dynamic there and understand that things are going to be changing in the near to midterm to address those capital needs of the system. That's what we'll be talking about today. Just going back to that Ames report for a graphical context, and we're going to come back to this chart later in the presentation, but it's simply showing in red where the high is out of that group of 42, where the median is in gray, and where Marion currently ranks under current rates and charges specific to the sanitary sewer utility at those usage levels. Since you've had this in advance, I don't know there's a whole lot of mystery there, but I think it's useful to have this graphical representation. And again, in terms of where we're going, we'll re-reference this later in this presentation. Anything here before we jump into kind of the first section of some utility metrics? All right. So overall, and I don't mean to oversimplify things, but rate making is fairly straightforward. We need to understand what our constraints are in terms of what our costs are going to be for a utility system. We can think of those in some big picture frameworks of operating costs to manage the system, debt payments that we'll need to make on an outstanding debt, capital costs, and then managing reserves. But if we've got that context, we need to find a way to figure out what is fair and equitable to charge across customer classes based on the number of customers we have or plan to have, multiplied by those rates to create the revenues to pay for those needs. We're not splitting the atom here. That being said, we're sensitive to the unique situations for each community, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. What we really want to do is make sure we break this into 3 considerations. And I don't think we need to do all 3 of these things each and every time we address this council for future needs of the system. But in a big standpoint, we want to understand and identify those revenue requirements. To that, I mean, manage that context of operating costs, capital needs, and the pay-fors on those capital needs as it is comprised of pay-as-you-go revenue sources and debt obligations. That management with a long-term plan is going to help us understand how many dollars we need to create from the system on a given basis each year. The second piece would be a cost of service analysis, and that's about appropriately allocating costs to the various types of users on the system. Now, staff will jump in here and correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things we've heard is really you don't have the type of high water, high strength type users where this is going to be particularly appropriate to capture that necessarily from a ongoing rate standpoint. I think, again, to reiterate some of the opening comments, we might want to think about how new development or redevelopment gets charged up front. The cost of service is not a part that we feel is going to be particularly valuable at this time, but it's something I want to make sure council was aware of. And then the third piece under the rate structure would be the proposed rates. You know, there's all kinds of ways to go across those structures. We're not looking to necessarily make major changes at this time, but as the system evolves in the coming years, it's something we'll want to revisit, and we try to take a big picture approach today and make sure you're aware of these things as we go forward in the future. So what do I mean by that? And again, I think this is going to be something that some of you may already understand and recognize, but I want to be clear and I want to be transparent in this process. But most of the time we're talking about a base plus consumption, so a fixed plus variable component of the charges. We referenced the smaller fixed charges that the city currently has based on the way your users are set up. With that approach, it was a decision that was made previously by previous councils. We can think about that differently going forward if we so choose. We're not looking to make any major changes from this concept today, but we have the ability to do that going forward. What we mean by that is there can be a different weighting to the fixed charges billed each month to users versus how much weighting on variable charges, people paying for the usage that the city is paying for to be treated going forward. And that balance should be considered as your mix of expenditures changes over time. So when we talk about the increased capital needs on the system going forward, and the fact that you'll likely have more debt related to those capital projects, those are fixed costs. We might want to have more fixed revenues to overcome those considerations. And that's something we'll be thinking about on a go-forward basis. I think the other piece of the puzzle that may or may not be applicable going forward is thinking about some of the American Water Works Association's best practices. So do we want to think about multiple tiers for the types of users and usage that are out there? We're not going to go down that path at tonight's conversation, but as it evolves, we want to think about equitable rates and charges for all types of user classes. And those can be either in a flat structure, which is what the city does currently, or a declining or inclining block rate, which basically means, is there a discount or a premium charged to users that use more water on your system and therefore pay higher water and sewer fees? Something to consider as we go forward, and we're just trying to be thorough today. All right. There we go. So what are the kind of metrics that we're tracking here? And I think it's important as we start with that to consider both the concepts of liquidity that we want to talk about as we think about tracking this over the long term. The first is debt service coverage. And the city has had a limited amount of debt outstanding, although the current debt is one of the reasons for our discussion today, which we'll get to in a moment. Debt coverage is a lot like EBITDA from the business world in terms of presenting the ability after paying operating costs to have sufficient liquidity to cover debt needs and other capital and reserve needs of the system going forward. Because it is a proactive approach to make sure we've got that type of coverage, it is a measure of long-term liquidity and financial stability of the system. That is different than kind of our cash days on hand, cash balance, our rainy day reserves, if you will, which, while as a measure of liquidity, is really a measure of our short-term liquidity for the system. We want to be managing both of those to be adequate, not just to the legal limitations, not just necessarily rating agencies' considerations, but in a long-term plan to make sure that we can handle any changing dynamics in terms of when money needs to be coming in or out the door for certain capital project needs. So one of the things we talk about here is $1.10 for every dollar of debt. And that is really the bare minimum through things like the state program, basically a 10% cushion to make sure you can make your future debt payments adequately. The second piece would be maybe 90 days cash on hand is something we commonly think about. That may or may not be a good fit based on the size of the system. Sometimes we want to make sure we've got $1 million, $2 million, what have you, to have appropriate cash reserves for those rainy day needs we're talking about. Ideally, once we either have debt on hand that we need to manage to, or as part of the city's financial policies, we'd have this modeled for each of the utility funds, specific here, the sanitary sewer fund, so that staff is managing to those needs on a go-forward basis. That sets our revenue requirements, and that helps us set our rates going forward. Everybody tracking and following here? I see the nodding heads, but please feel free to jump in. So let's talk about the funding sources we're talking about today. We're not going to get in the weeds here, but when we talk a little bit about the sewer utility, I think there's a couple schools of thought. One is each operating utility should be operating on its own. Water pays for water, sewer pays for sewer, storm for storm, et cetera, and et cetera. That being said, the city does have potential eligibility to use other sources, and we can talk about that on a go-forward basis. And those are the voted sales tax revenue stream of the city does give the city authority to use those dollars to pay for certain sanitary sewer projects of the system. The other place would be in urban renewal revenues from existing TIF areas or future TIF areas. Infrastructure like sewer can be part of those types of projects, and in certain cases could be eligible to be paid for by TIF projects. I think in the past, there have been situations where the city has identified certain needs to be paid from these sources, and we can continue to identify those opportunities that are out there. But primarily, sewer pays for sewer here, with the exception of unique opportunities. Okay. Double scroll. Not going to read off the entire page here, but I think it's really clear that we want to have a strategic approach. So when we get something like the HDR engineering report, in a perfect world, we could address all of those capital projects that day, not borrow and not have people's rates go up. But that's not how things actually work. What we need to think about is how we can actually address those projects in terms of the size of the bite that we can take off at a time, either from an operational standpoint or from really a capital management standpoint. Do we have enough dollars to pay for these projects? Do we have enough access to capital to pay for those projects? And when we're tracking on a mid to long-term basis, we can thoughtfully lay those out and align the revenues generated better with the city's CIP and make sure that's an iterative process that's continually working across the year, not just through a budget process. All right. I think the second piece is we want to do that in a way that minimizes impact to your constituents. So if we know we're going to need more revenues out of the system and we know we're growing, we want to do these projects in a way that modestly impacts all users of the system, not just today's users, but users down the road. It's one of the biggest reasons for utilizing debt for these projects. These are long-term, in some cases 20, 30, or 50-year type infrastructure projects, and we can allocate the repayment of those projects over the folks who are going to benefit from that infrastructure being in place for the city. We talked a little bit about the debt coverage element that's out there. I'm not going to reiterate that point, but I do want to highlight, not just for council, but also the public, the fact that utility revenue bonds do not count against the city's general obligation bond limit or your debt capacity. This debt would stand on its own. We don't have the same type of capacity considerations we do with tax-backed debt. The limitations for capacity are what our rates and charges can cover, and that's the debt coverage considerations. I would also say I want to break down the difference between revenue debt and GO debt into utilizing different funding sources. I think the three big concepts here would be the bond market, like the bonds that you issued last week publicly, direct bank loans, some of which you did in 2020, including the only outstanding sewer debt currently, or a government source for financing, whether that's through the USDA or and more likely through the state of Iowa, Iowa Finance Authority's SRF program, that's State Revolving Fund Program, SRF. So if you hear those acronyms, I know certain people don't love acronyms in this room, so we'll try to make sure that's very clear. It is an administered program that the state has created, identified, and runs to provide low-cost loans for water quality infrastructure across the state. We think that's a good potential source for the city to utilize. We've talked a little bit about staff, what that may look like for eligible projects. It's a path, if you go down, you might be issuing a fair amount of debt through that program. If you choose not to, there could be reasons for that as well. That is not necessarily a revenue versus geo consideration. It is a funding source. As if it was a bank, the state is your bank, if you want to think about that way for investment, okay? Again, I think regardless of what you're going to be doing for debt payments, we want to make sure that we can repay those future obligations, whether that's debt we're planning to issue now or in the future. And that's really what we've worked to model to think about on a go-forward basis, all right?
Really quick on the debt. Ryan pointed this out really quick, and it's a good point to make. City of Marion historically has used general obligation debt for the sewer. So we would basically abate that debt with transfers in from the sewer fund. It's important for you to also have that history as we move forward.
Because that's important when you look at your debt capacity and how it factors into our credit score. So alternative funding source with less of an impact.
And then just to wrap up sort of on the general information here, if I can figure out the wheel. It's going. There we go. Just other funding sources. I want to make sure people were aware, and I think the city staff's already working on some of these potential options that are out there, but we did not want to be remiss in mentioning it here in this public forum. You know, grant funding, I think, is something we all know is potentially available, especially over the programs at the federal level over the last couple of years, and the state working through those programs as well. So one of those is the Water Infrastructure Fund program, with another acronym for you, that's administered through the Iowa Finance Authority. And I know there's a project as part of one of the 2080 participation groups, the segment the city would be managing, Mike, I guess would be the right word. And the plan is to apply for some grant funding for up to 15% of that cost. So obviously we're applicable. The city's going to be aggressive and proactive in seeking those funding. Water quality is obviously a major initiative at the federal and state level. So the type of improvements that we're talking about for the city's sewer fund should carry over for potential eligibility in some of those projects. I talked a little bit about stand on its own. We talked about the other sources. I think it's a matter of being thoughtful of how do we combine projects in the future, what's a reasonable way to address them, and just have that approach flow back through the analysis that we're doing. Again, we're doing that a little bit more in real time. We're bringing you snapshots for those feedback items, but this is the type of thought process that we're going to be talking about, and as a good segue into our next set of slides. On the general framework here, before we move to the next section, any questions from council or anything to add from staff at this time? We're going to talk a little bit long-term planning, which I think we all think of as forward-looking. But let's talk with a 5-year history of some audited financials for the sanitary sewer performance. There's a few things I want to point out on this slide. I think the first thing is on the top line revenue. You know, you'll notice just under $4 million in fiscal 17 to about $5.4 million in fiscal 21. I will tell you, with our projections, just on a preliminary basis, by the end of the decade, that revenue level needs to be about double where it is. So think 10.8 rather than 5.4 about where we're going as a system. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. You'll also notice operating expenses in the margin there has been pretty narrow historically. And then you notice in the middle of the page, the debt outstanding. Again, that debt is specific to the Series 2020 bank loan, But one of the things that was noted in the recent audit, and one of the things we want to proactively address at this time is making sure we have sufficient revenues, net of those operating costs, to cover debt payments next year and going forward. And I know we're working on some things on the operating expenditure side, but this is part of that process, knowing that we need to increase revenues for the long term anyway. One of the things that we want to tie both the near term and mid to long term needs together for this purpose. You also notice the ending unrestricted cash level there, 90 days cash on hand, 25%, a really nice round number at the end of fiscal 21. As you can imagine, if the size of our operations grow in terms of both revenues and expenditures, we're going to want to put some thought into what we do to make sure those reserves stay healthy on a proportionate basis going forward as we continue to grow. So again, we're just going back to those long-term and short-term liquidity metrics that we mentioned in the general section as it relates to the specifics historically here for the city, before moving on a little bit on our projection. So slide 16, just a little bit of a summary here. I mentioned this already on the previous slides, but the other driver of this are going to be the near to midterm capital needs. And I'm going to summarize that a little bit further here on the next slide. I mentioned that investment in infrastructure is going to be a universal consideration for all communities. The city's already proactively addressed some of that by the HDR engineering study. So we've got a little bit of a let's call it a menu, not a buffet of capital project needs for the sanitary sewer system to work from. And staff's aligned to put that into practice as part of the CIP. There's also other elements of that. Because of that significant capital investment, it's a dynamic time for the sanitary sewer utility. And that's why it's important for us to have a little bit broader long-term planning and long-term budgetary planning tool that we're talking a little bit about today. So what does that mean overall in terms of some of those costs, just to quantify? So net of some of the offsetting sources of revenue, about $30 million in the 5-year CIP. That's fiscal 23 through fiscal 27, okay? For context, the previous 5 fiscal years of audited financials, the total is $7.5 million. So this is 4 times more capital project level of effort before inflation, Mike. Right now programmed versus what you did in the previous 5 years. That's the significant change we're talking about. I've got some additional details here, and Mike, Ryan, please jump in here, making sure I'm not stepping on my toes, but Indian Creek and Dry Run Creek sewer projects, that's part of the 2080 arrangement with some of the other corridor communities. There's about $14.8 million. That was the updated cost estimate for the applicable segments for the city and what their shares would be. The city share is $14.8 million. Right now, the net program for fiscal 23 through 27 is about $2.4 million. That's in your CIP, but we know we've got more down the road. Those segments are long-term projects. Mike, you might want to speak a little bit more to that, but those are out there and not yet accounted for in this next 5-year CIP.
Yeah, and that 14.8 million is a very rough guess. It's not engineered design plans, and that is today's dollars. So as you know, with segment 7 and dealing with the property owner, that was delayed several years. So every year we delay it, costs aren't going down.
The next portion, the sanitary trunk sewer improvements, the HDR study had approximately 45 million. And Mike, you can speak to this too. There's a couple ways to slice that HDR study, but I think that 45 million is a reasonable number. About half of that is accommodated in the 5-year CIP of the city currently. So there's more beyond that group of projects. And Mike, again, I don't think that's indexed for inflation at this time. Correct. Okay. The other piece that's in there would be the public services facility. And I want to make sure I speak this correctly, so Ryan and Leanne jump in. But right now, while there are costs associated with closing out the existing project that were funded, appropriated dollars for that, we know there's some potential additional cost there. Sewer shares in the 15 to 25% range of that project. That's going to be pending some of the insurance claims and litigation as that plays out. Those are not currently programmed. So any additional cost to the city above what's currently in the CIP would potentially impact this as well. Am I saying that right, Ryan? Okay. And then the fleet replacement piece is also not necessarily included at this time. And I know that's something we want to be addressing in the near future as well. So just big picture on the CIP. I think these are the big ticket dollar items. And I think at this point, it'd be good, any comments additionally from staff, because it's important to hear from the experts rather than just the numbers person here.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just a question on HDR. For some reason, I thought that study, Mike, identified $80 million worth of work.
Yeah, so I think it's close to 83 million. So what Michael did was some of that included the Indian Creek and Dry Creek trunk sewer in their thing. So it's a little complicated because it's almost double dipping. So what he did was he took out those projects that are already identified in Indian Creek and Dry Creek
Okay.
Run and broke them out so that they were separate because they were in there basically twice. So the HDR study took that into account when they
Okay.
did that.
All right, thanks. That helps.
And then each segment, so those council that are not aware, is based on the flow that each municipality wanted as part of that 28E. So as we get farther north or upstream in our system, the city of Marion is a less participant in that based on, we'll have less flow. And segments that are 12 plus, we actually are 0% because unless the annexation boundaries change, we won't have any flow going through that. If that were to change because of annexation agreements that get modified and we have all of a sudden flow that goes into that, then we would have to pay a proportionate share based on the total volume that we want to go through that pipe.
Go ahead, Steve.
So as long as we're talking about the HDR study, the 80 million or $83 million, what that was a combination of replacement of existing sewer and maybe enlarging the capacity of some of those lines? And did some of that also include growth areas as well that is not existing today? Was it a combination of existing and new growth for those, some of those dollars?
So for the most part, it was the hydraulic study and it would show, those growth areas and not necessarily the new pipe that would need to go in, but what existing pipe needs to be modified to. So let's say, for example, there's a sewer that goes through the golf course and
Yeah.
that needs to be upsized because at the time, it technically could be sized big enough to serve the city of Alburnett. But by the time we get there, we'll have to replace it. So you have to take that into consideration of
Okay.
what size do you build today, knowing that eventually it has to be replaced.
So it's a combination of aging, replacement, as well as upsizing it for future growth. And the dollars for the future, for the piping for the future growth is not part of that 83, but is causing, the future growth is causing some of the investment of that $83 million.
Yeah, so a new subdivision, how we have that work is a developer is required to put in an 8-inch main. That's the minimum size the DNR requires. Let's say that it's the school district putting in the lines on Echo Hill that they put in. So when they did that urban sprawl and put those two schools up there, they built a larger sewer system than what they needed.
Right.
And based on that, we actually set up an access fee, which is code 100 or 101 or combination thereof. And so as Kent Bakken and others are doing development around there and tying into that sewer system, based on that ordinance, that oversizing, it's basically the school upfronted all that cost. And as people tie into that, then they write the city a check, and depending on how that was worked, then we write the school a check. So typically, all the new stuff is going to be built by the developers, whether they have to cash flow it or whether we have to cash flow it. And so that's all future expenses. This is more, if we don't fix the issues that we have today, we're not going to be able to grow.
If I recall from the study, some of the discussion we had also revolved around that there are different future growth areas that the city can more easily accommodate.
Yep.
If I recall, that was some of the discussion we had there as well. Not that we want to stop growth, but yet if somebody wants to buy some farmland a mile outside of town and, but there's a lot closer areas that we can more easily accommodate and handle from a standpoint of CIP and investment.
Yep, so we had a primary growth area and a secondary growth area. So not
That's right. Okay,
that we
that's what it
wouldn't
was.
want a secondary growth area, but it costs more to develop
Right.
in that area.
Okay, thank you.
So let's break this down back into something like that revenue requirement concept I outlined in the first section. So let's just play a little for instance here. The 5.4 million of operating expenditures in the fiscal 21 audit. I know we'd all like to have some upside in the resolution with the discussions ongoing with Cedar Rapids, but let's just keep that $5.4 million total operating expense projected over the next 5 years. That's a total of $27 million. Then let's take the current CIP and work the other direction, the 30 million that we talked about overall on average, and this is not necessarily how it's spent, but $6 million per year. If you add those together, just before we figure out how debt management goes into this, that'd be $11.4 million necessary per year over the next 5 years to meet the needs of the system. That's not including the public services building or fleet. That's not including any inflationary costs either on operating or capital. And we all know, at least here on recent capital projects, where that's been heading. So if we're bringing in about 5.4 million, and that's 11.4 million, pay as you go is not a sufficient option here. There's going to need to be some debt leverage to make the math work on this. I appreciate hearing from the bond guy that that is a nail and I'm a hammer to solve that. That's not what I'm getting at. And I think it's important that we think about this from a long-term standpoint. So on slide 19, I want to address a few things. One, I know interest rates are rising. They're still reasonably low. I'm not advocating, we'll have some discussions further about this, but a funding source through the state is not moving while rates are going up. So they're all in cost for 20-year borrowing are 2% still. And I don't know if that's going to change anytime soon. Because of that cost certainty, it has been a good option for larger and long-term capital project needs around the state. So let's keep that in mind as we talk about this. The second piece here is we're not talking about borrowing forever and ever, and we're not talking about borrowing for all. I think it's really important that there's a continued level of pay-as-you-go investment for any utility operation to make sure we're meeting replacement cost needs. I think one of the best lessons I heard from an engineer early in my career was thinking about the great benefits we had from some of the infrastructure put in 100 years ago. It was put in with 50-year replacement expectations, and some of that lasted 100 or 120 years in some major metropolitan cities like Omaha, Lincoln, St. Louis have great studies, great pictures of wooden pipes being replaced, some of the types of replacement Mike's talking about. If we're going to fund investment as if it's a 50-year replacement life cycle and we're only putting half the money in, we're banking on that being 100-year infrastructure. So we need to be thoughtful about our level of investment and not just be a debt manager here for the sewer utility and think about that balance going forward. We don't want to have a long-term reliance on borrowing, but we know we need to split the difference. And that's the projections that we're coming up and talking about with you today. And again, I know I mentioned it before, I want to keep reiterating, not just for the council, but for the public, we want to leverage other funding sources where possible. Grant funding, other partnerships, TIF, sales taxes, where it's the right fit, even though we want the sewer system to primarily stand on its own. I've got a little bit more content here. I see some nods, I see some smiles, but I just want to make sure if there's anything to jump in here as we keep moving forward.
On the very bottom line, remind me, WIF funding, what is that?
Water Infrastructure Fund. Yep. And I should have made this, see if we did the legal
Here,
letter, it
you-
would have been all spelled
Did we have
out.
that discussion about acronyms already?
I know. There we go. So yeah,
Water-
Water Infrastructure Fund. And again, to reiterate, that's federal dollars that the state's
Right.
administering. Iowa Finance Authority has been pretty good at getting that out the door with the application and paperwork. Mike, I know you're working on that, but 15% grant funding for specified projects. And it's a relatively small pool, but you'd think the type of regionalization projects like the 28E for Indian Creek and Dry Run Creek would be prime contenders for those funds.
Okay.
Yep.
Just go ahead, Grant.
Just, I have a lingering question about the state SRF.
Yeah.
Is that a stable, predictable, ongoing option, or is it subject to the peculiarities of the Golden Dome?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So let me phrase it this way. I think the folks that assembled that program nearly 30 years ago had a real thought to protecting and ensuring water quality for the long-term sustainability of Iowa's future. And regardless of what you hear out of the Capitol, I think it's clear that water quality continues to be a fundamental pursuit from the legislature. The Iowa Finance Authority and its kind of quasi combination with IEDA over the last few years, I think is a net positive for water quality in Iowa, because people understand the rising costs of these projects and are being thoughtful about the requirements folks like the DNR are putting on communities. And if the state is going to mandate certain water quality and treatment standards, they understand they need to have low cost sources of funds for communities like Marion. There are plenty of communities in more rural parts of the state that could potentially benefit from USDA rural development funding, but you're not going to have that eligibility based on your population size. And the state understands there's a gap to fill. No one can guarantee what the future would be, but because the program is exactly that, a state revolving fund that's professionally managed and at a very high level with the state of Iowa, I have a lot of confidence as a stable funding source going forward, not just for access to capital, but also low cost capital. The trend over the last 20 years has only been for interest rates to go down. They have not been reactive to the whims of the economy, which is good. The last part that I would add is I know when rates got very low over the last few years, I had certain engineers I worked with say, gosh, Mike, couldn't you have beaten that in the bond market? And maybe on a certain day or two, I could. These types of large projects, Mike and Ryan can attest to, bids could be uncertain, timing can be uncertain, weather uncertainty. Having a stable, long-term, low-cost financing option is a pretty good play when we're talking about these big projects that take years of planning, because we know it's there and be reliable, and the state recognizes that. Long answer, sir, but I just think it's important to be thorough because it's such an important part of the state right now.
And I really quickly just wanted to add to that the water department does currently already leverage that funding source. Since 2010, just for the record.
And just to add on, and I don't want to muddy the waters, but with the SRF program, they also have, there's under the SRF, you can do a sponsored project. So if you apply for these funds, you borrow this funds from the state, you go through a process where you have this sponsored project, and then what they do is basically rebate you a portion of the interest that you're paying on the debt to reinvest in stormwater. So, and that
You could really start to leverage that once you've got scale in this project. And being thoughtful about that, we've seen communities, especially the size and scale of what Marion's operation would be, tremendously benefit from those types of programs. You almost have a never-ending need of projects. So to get free money or get your money back to you is a pretty sweet deal.
So just on this SRF, then is there a fixed number of dollars that the state puts into that every year?
So it's funded by a couple things. So there are federal dollars attached to that program, if you want to think about how that flows through the state. But the state also borrows money to fund the program and continue to expand the program. Plus, as a revolving fund over 30 years, the interest paid back into the program continues to be reinvested. So it's sort of a snowball rolling down the hill in our favor. Yeah.
Okay.
So with that, let's go to slide 20 and just talk a little bit about the rate study and model construction process. And I know no one really wants to think about spreadsheets here at this time and hour, but at that point, I want to be clear as this ties back into the foundational concepts for utility finance that we talked about, is really understanding what all the data is. And the city and the staff you have lots of expertise on staff here. You have great information and great data. We're trying to make sure we've got that accumulated in a way that can be dynamic and provide real-time results for not just staff, but you as decision makers going forward. Beyond collecting that data, we want to understand some of the existing policies, and if those are working, great. If those need tweaked as part of your upcoming budget process next year, we can make sure those are sustainable for the future and aligning with our overall priorities throughout the city's foundational documents. From there, assembling the revenue requirements that we've talked about, those same types of expenditures on the system and the sources of potential funding. Thinking about the different customers and class, and then creating what we call a base scenario. We want a base case scenario that we can build from to play those types of what ifs that are very, very important for our decision-making process. Councilmember Jensen, you mentioned the growth versus replacement consideration. For certain communities, we've modeled it out that way, where it's about, hey, how can we maintain and sustain as a goal, right? And then be thoughtful about our strategic growth. I think that plays nicely in what the city wants to do, and being able to look at those what ifs in real time as we get updated capital cost numbers, as we get feedback about implementation, about the HDR engineering report, as we get feedback on the Cedar Rapids study, as we get feedback on the public services facility, we can incorporate those into the dynamic that we have there. Not wanting to dwell too much on this, but you know, it's pretty sad for a bond guy having to get an illustration. That's what we got. Go ahead.
Just a question, Michael, maybe this is really for Ryan. It's HR Green doing that study with Cedar Rapids?
Yes,
What- Go ahead.
they're assisting us in understanding the data for our upcoming meeting with them tomorrow.
Okay. So that, in essence, that I kind of consider that maybe a technical audit. When do you think that that's going to be closed up and finished with data that we can see?
I don't know. We'll have a better understanding after tomorrow.
Okay, I withdraw my question for 24 hours.
Could we jump in just on a point on that? Just, I know it's a little bit out of order on the slides, but I want to be clear regardless of who your treatment provider is or how that works. The study is one element of that process. Everywhere, whether it's for water sourcing or for sewer treatment, we're going to continue to see those costs increase as well for those providers. So remember that snapshot in time versus the dynamic element. There are going to continue to be cost pass-throughs that your provider for treatment carries along beyond the results of this information. And then we'd all be remiss. It's not direct for Marion at this point, but your treatment provider is, in this case, Cedar Rapids, is going to be faced with the nutrient removal standards that are facing the entire state. We talked about the DNR requirements. They'll have costs for that. They'll have infrastructure for that. They'll have treatment needs for that. Those will ultimately be passed along to the city as well. Just to be crystal clear on that point there.
But as we go through that process tomorrow and however long that takes, once we get that data, as Michael mentioned, this model that we're building out, we'll be able to insert that with known data to kind of project what we need to do and how fast or slow do we need to start working on some other things, the HDR study, other capital projects. So again, it's data to help inform that decision-making process for you all, and to be completely transparent with the community as to how their money is being spent in investment in our community.
Just the creation, and it's not just the model framework, but I think it's important to think about this as the waterfall. So your meters, in this case with the water meters measuring usage, what have you, those are the cash registers of your system, right? So each month people are being metered for usage and billed on usage. Those create your operating revenues. Your operating revenues first pay for your operating expenses, then they would pay for any debt payments, go and replenish the reserves of the system, the cash balances, and then cover any pay-as-you-go capital improvement projects left over. The balance is on your bottom line. So we want to model that up, being thoughtful about where your future debt would go and projecting that as it ties into the CIP needs and then eventual actual projects as we move along. So that's when we talk about not just the model, but the waterfall for that frame of reference that we've been discussing. So the dashboard tool, that was the first tab there. And I think that's the key goal of this is, can we have a really solid base case, foundational understanding of the operating costs, capital costs, future debt payments, such that we're meeting those metrics that we've targeted and highlighted. And then think about when we're facing the challenges Marion's going to be looking at on a go-forward basis in terms of CIP implementation and timing, and then the resulting user rates to pay for all these needs, playing that what if in real time on that long-term budgetary planning tool. That's the goal for us, and we're quantifying and understanding those needs. So the balance of today's conversation is going to be about the near term and what we're looking for over the next couple months from council. But behind the scenes, I want to be clear what we're building on in the sewer fund over the balance of this year that we're going to have queued up for those next sets of decision-making implementation priorities, whether it's specific projects, feedback on those three major drivers we talked about to start the conversation, or at the latest point as part of your fiscal 24 budget planning work. So that's what we're really working to align with staff and build towards over the coming months. We think we've got a very good start, but we also think there's a sense of, we want to make sure we're starting that process today and bringing this to you from a big picture perspective, as well as the micro to finish up our conversation today.
And just bringing to the forefront a reminder that this is in alignment with the strategic plan. This is goal 2.2 as part of that integrated 5-year financial plan. This is a huge key and a huge step in that process, is this dashboard tool.
If I can add just one more thing, and Leanne, correct me if I'm wrong, but as council members, you're probably thinking, okay, so you've explained a lot of the strategy and what we're building and where we're going to go. We're going to talk about the near term here in a few. So when are we going to see this again? And one thing that you'll be able to look forward to is Leanne and Finance is putting together a budget calendar, which we hope to have to you soon. That will help identify the checkpoints throughout the year that we will be coming back to you, having some of these conversations throughout the year as we build the budget, instead of just having one budget session like we've had in the past. And that was based on feedback that we heard at our last budget meeting. So frequent touch points with the CIP, frequent touch points with the strat plan, and we'll be incorporating that into our budget calendar. Is that?
The last set of slides here. So upcoming fiscal year rate considerations. So again, this is reiterating the slide that we started with, kind of building on the conversation we've had so far today, where we are in terms of comparison, and then where we're going in terms of where our revenues have been as part of the total city spend and where CIP projects are headed over the next 5 years. And we know we need to better align those revenues with the future needs of the system. Okay. With that, the potential impact, and we're all sensitive to those user rates as part of the overall cost of living in Marion. That being said, I think it's important context that for the average residential monthly bill over the last 5 years, that's gone up a combined $5.18 per month. So that's a dollar a year if you think about it in terms of tracking with that. There's going to need to be a additional need for revenues of the sewer system. I appreciate I'm the guy from 100 miles away. I do this a lot on the utility side and have these conversations. I know there's folks are sensitive to rate impacts, and I appreciate that. But one of the things that should be focused, especially tying into your comparable communities who are also going to have additional infrastructure needs, it's not that your rates are going to be high. It's that they've been artificially low for some time. So that's part of the need here in catching up on the infrastructure considerations. With that, we're talking about over the long term, potentially a need of $20 to $25 per month on the residential bill. And that's out there in the 10-year range from what we're looking at today. Things can change that. Growth can change that. When we talk about some of the adjustments we need, I want to couch those in revenue adjustments over the long term that can be balanced by both rate increases and growth in your customer base. So let's be thoughtful about both of those things on a long-term consideration, though we're talking about specific to rates here to finish up today. I think it's important to note, as we talked about, not just necessarily coming in or coming out of budget process each year, but we'll need to be able to show rate sufficiency when we issue any related debt for the sewer utility on a go-forward basis. Regardless of your financing source, whether that's through the bond market, a bank, or the SRF program, the way those legal documents are created are showing you need to show that you've got rate sufficiency, you've adopted rate and charges that are sufficient to pay your debts going forward. In the case of the state, they require that to be provided before closing of the financing. So that is another inflection point. So either a budget throughout the year, the spend for capital projects or resultant borrowing, would potentially be those places where we'd revisit what we need to do with rates. We're trying to be in a proactive place to manage that ahead of time rather than reactive when we have to do those things going forward. Okay.
Go ahead.
Michael, just to benchmark what I thought I heard you say, that $20 to $25 per month on residential bill, that is out in the future. Did you say 10 years?
I'd say 8 to 10 year range. Yeah,
Okay.
based on our preliminary look. And again, I think we've got a number of moving targets, the big three that we've identified and talked about, but also what inflationary costs look like. So it's a matter of timing and implementation of those capital projects. That will be the main driver. And then also ongoing treatment costs, knowing that the city of Cedar Rapids treats the city's water and will also have capital needs of their own to pass through.
Okay, thanks.
You bet. So the first target at this point is, what do we want to address now? But we also want to be thinking about taking a step towards the future, right? A long-term rate target. And we mentioned needing to meet our covenants for the 2020 bank loan. So that's our priority in the near term. And we know we're still waiting for some of those three, the big three, right? The Cedar Rapids study, public services facility consideration, and really on the HDR engineering site, the timing implementation of those projects. That's going to drive this over the long term, but we need to start making movement now. And we know since there's going to be additional movement down the road, it's a situation where we've got to balance both of these at this time and can achieve both in the near term. I think we've been clear today, and I think the council seems to understand this, that there's going to be additional rates coming. There's not some magic answer to solve this today. That being said, we want to be proactive in starting that conversation in the near term, and that's what we want to leave with a little bit of consideration today. So let's show what that looks like. The last couple years of charges with the fixed and variable charges, you'll notice it's the $2 and $2. So when we think about a $4 fixed charge, that's the service charges and the replacement charges combined. And then the variable charge is on a per unit basis. We may want to talk about unit a little bit further at some point as well. I've translated that to gallons just for that typical user usage monthly bill. About 4,000 gallons for residential, 20,000 would be kind of a small commercial consideration there. And where that's been over the last couple of years with the modest variable charge increases that have been enacted by the city council. And then the concept of where we're looking to go for a projected 2023. To be very clear, the single move would be an increase in the sewer variable charge to an even $6 per unit starting July 1 of 2022. I know I put those caveats up there a number of times, but I want to reiterate once again, we've got to continue to evaluate these. That's what we've built and we're building towards to be able to bring those evaluations back. And there'll be future decisions for council on how to implement these going forward. So this is a concept and recommendation at this time for potential near-term implementation, but we appreciate there's other factors as part of this process as well that will be revisited in the near to midterm.
And while council's thinking about that, just some bigger items to think about. Those of you that don't know, the American Society of Civil Engineers puts out a report every 4 years. So currently on the national report card, was just released in 2021, sanitary sewer got a grade of D+. That's nationally. Iowa's last report card was in 2019. We just started working on the new one that'll be coming out next year, had a C-. So at least the state of Iowa is doing better than nationally, but this is an issue everywhere. So it's not just a Marion problem, as Michael brought up. This is a national issue. And then also wanted to point out that this is also part of the strat plan number 4, sustainable infrastructure. Because if we don't keep investing in it, we're not going to be able to grow.
Your Honor, question here. Yeah, Mike, on that federal and state evaluation relative to where we're graded, is that taken any further down to the county level perhaps?
It's not. It stays at the state level. I can tell you that we are gearing up to have the next report card for the state. We meet later in a couple weeks to start the next report card for the state of Iowa. So we'll see if the grades have shifted at all. Obviously, there's things like the ARPA money, but a lot of that just became available. So it's hard for that to already be implemented to see that actually have an effect yet.
Thanks.
So what does this look from a comparison standpoint? I told you we'd revisit this chart. In terms of where we are, again, that's the city in blue current, and the very bright green is where it would be going with this implemented. You'll notice it's no change on the base charges, the 0 cubic feet of usage. It would move the Marion rate in line with the gray median for 600. That's kind of the statewide typical monthly residential usage. I want to be clear though, that's the median for over 10,000 population communities last year. And everyone's in the same boat. Everyone's evaluating rates often annually. So there's always a little bit of arrears here to this effect. The same consideration at 1,000 cubic feet, just north of the median here in this case. But for context, I think this is important to consider. And I do think that that Ames report and study is worth continuing to reference as we make these decisions on a go forward basis for the community. I'll wrap up here on the last side by just talking about an action plan going forward. And our staff will have some more feedback here for you with detail, and then council, of course, any more questions we're happy to answer at this time. But the consideration would be for a rate adjustment that could be enacted for July 1 of 2022. And that allows us to capture those additional dollars for all of the fiscal year to make sure we can have that rate sufficiency for debt coverage needs of the outstanding bank loan. That's going to meet our near-term needs, we believe, knowing that we've got those 3 moving pieces that are still out there. We're going to continue working with the city team on the long-term planning model and be able to evaluate some of those updated CI expectations in the future. You know, again, I talked about those milestone dates, either a future near-term financing or as part of that fiscal 24 budget process. We'd be coming back with another high-level and detailed approach for where we are going and what we need to do on the sewer side for council at that time. So appreciate that's plenty out of me. There's a lot of resources already in this room, so I'd encourage the council to keep asking some questions while this is fresh, but appreciate your time and feedback here today. Staff's got anything else, we'll go from there, questions, and get you on with your night. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, questions? Go ahead, Steve.
Biggest request I'm gonna have is on page 15, we're showing the audit for the last 5 years.
Yeah.
What you have not done with this change to $6 of the sewer variable charge is show us what the projection would be for fiscal year 23. So I think before we're really able to make a decision on that, I'd like to see the impact of what the current budget might be, and then what the impact of this charge would be. I
Absolutely.
totally understand the fact that we've been in violation of our sewer bond covenant. And I'm assuming they gave us a waiver for this last year. So I understand that. I understand the need to do something now as we go forward, and we need something right away, specifically just because of that violation.
Yep.
I think we need to be being fiscally responsible to do something right now. Now, whether that's $6 or whether that's right amount, if you give us some projections on that, we're going to be able to assess that. And maybe you look at a different dollar amount. I don't know why $6 was picked. The projections will bear that out.
Yep. And we've taken a good shot at that.
Yeah, I'm sure you have
I think
already.
that's the next step to build exactly. on this.
Exactly. And I understand that too.
Yep.
So, but, you know, we're here today because the difficult decision in situations like this was not done 10, 15, 20 years ago. And that is to establish that sinking fund, to do what needed to be done to fund some of those current needs. Now, at least we now have the information today from the HRG study. So we have the information. I think now we're being proactive about what needs to be done. It may not be good news to our citizens that this is going to result in a rate increase, but doing nothing would be absolutely detrimental to their services in the future, any future growth that we could have. So yeah, I totally agree you're gonna need to keep increasing some of those charges and then somehow match that up with the fixed side with some debt service. So what that formula is, obviously you've outlined, there's gonna be some now additional work to bring that, but just to assess the $6 near charge, I would like to see the projection for fiscal year 23 with and without it.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Go ahead, Sarah.
I'm very new at this, so I'm absorbing a lot.
Yeah, this
Okay,
is a- this
so
is a
I'm going
lot
to
today.
ask,
Yeah.
I'm going to ask probably what's too basic of a question. I know. That's what I feel like. That's what I feel like on this. I keep feeling like I'm listening to the questions being asked by those who have been around this longer and kind of picking up pieces, but you just said something in the presentation that I wanted to clarify, and it was kind of made me think, and again, one of the staff's going to get to sit down with me and kind of really do a basic tutorial on this, but so does growth, you made a comment about like growth helping with this, but then it also seems to hurt us because we have more people coming in. So when is growth good or bad, or where is it good and where is it bad?
It's good. So if you think about the sewer system as a network, everybody's paying into the network. So the more users you have, the more they're picking up their share. It can be bad if you're not planning properly for that growth, which is why the HDR study is so important, is it gives us a kind of a roadmap of the investments we need to make to be prepared for that. So growth is good, and the system, more people are paying into the system. We have some clarity of what we need to do. Now, if we don't do it, then we get stuck behind the 8 ball, and that's when the growth could become bad because we're now in a reactive state. And if we're in a reactive state, it costs us more because now we're not able to control that. We're reacting to, we got a developer that's developing this land, and now we got to do this. Well, now we got to flip something in a CIP and borrow more money and get caught up over here, and that puts us over here behind pace.
I was smiling because I think that was the perfect municipal governance question, period.
Yeah, good question.
Good, Steve. Is that good? Okay, Steve.
So one more question, another question I wrote down when we were talking about the fixed charge that we have per residential home. A while back, we talked about modifying that or changing that for the multifamily complexes around the city, where we were gonna have, I think it used to be more for the one fixed charge for the entire building. We talked about changing that to a fixed unit price for each apartment in the building. Did we make that change?
I think it's still by the meter.
No, it's a mixed bag, and I was just with Ryan.
Sorry. You can go be Tom.
Then we'd be here all night. Todd Steigerwalt. Todd Steigerwalt, General Manager of the Marion Water Department. Currently, there are apartment units, and we are charging a $2 per fee per unit that's in that apartment, but yet we also have buildings that are senior living facilities, your nursing homes, that are only paying for their entire building $2. So those are things that we need to kind of look at and address. The Marion Water Board is meeting. We're having a public hearing, a little plug in for that on May 10th. And we are also looking at, instead of raising rates for the bulk of the revenue, the residential, we are now looking at doing something similar with the $2 per unit fee for the apartments units. We're going to do a $2, or actually we're going to go $4 per unit per apartment for a flat rate increase. They're right now, the people that are living in the apartments are not paying for water. They're not paying for this. It's kind of absorbed in the rent, but it's an equity thing. A residential person using about the same amount of money is paying a lot more than somebody in the apartment using that same amount of water. They're kind of getting the bulk water discount rate. So to equalize the residential, we're going to, right now, residential is paying this amount. We're going to increase that flat rate per apartment to kind of keep the playing fields even because a bulk of the water revenue is residential in Marion. So that's what our board is looking at doing coming up. We're anticipating about $150,000 of increased revenue through that. But as we looked at that, we noted that nursing homes are only getting charged $2 and nursing homes are generally full. And there might be a few other irregulars that are out there that we're going to try to discuss at a future public board meeting.
We have two fixed rates. The one fixed rate is for your sanitary sewer replacement. That goes to your CIP. That's $2 per unit.
Right.
The other flat charge or the other fixed rate is your, what we call our monthly O&M rate. And that's $2 per water meter. We did change that back in 2019 to correspond with our new treatment agreement. And what we did, that used to be $4 per month. We rolled it back to $2. Then we increased the variable charge in an effort to solve the issues associated with multifamily dwellings with that one water meter.
Okay.
So if you're in a multifamily unit, let's say a 4-unit complex or a 6-unit complex, your sanitary sewer fees were much lower because of that one water meter than they were in a single family home. And so we've been increasing the domestic user or the domestic user fee in order to offset that.
I mean, what trips me, I mean, obviously, we don't have any very, very large industrial water users like Cedar Rapids does, but we are going to be adding a number of larger multifamily complexes in the city over the next 2 years. So
Yeah, with
obviously, yeah, exactly. So I think I just needed a reminder of where we were at with all of those, because there's a lot of those coming on board.
Yep.
All right, thanks.
And we are on the increasing rate block structure. So the more water they use, the higher the rate is. It's a conservation tool that we use. So be careful what you irrigate. One just thing I would comment on or think about is the flat fee. If you can increase that, that's guaranteed. If you raise the flow rate higher, then that's based on flow. And if nobody's there, you're not getting the flow. Cedar Rapids has about $19 per month is their flat rate, just for comparison. So,
Great.
Well, yeah, so all of this discussion and I really appreciate this because it just, I mean, it's going to sharpen our thinking on the decisions we need to be making. But this takes me back a number of years, back when I was working for Alliant Energy's predecessor and thinking about the construction of the utility tariffs, electric utility tariffs. And what is striking to me, and Todd just kind of mentioned this, our fixed charge per month seems low, and I'm doing a little bit of eyeball ping pong between that and what the electric tariffs currently are. And if I recall, the basic service charge or meter charge for electric service is to help pay for the infrastructure to get the electricity to you. And then there are additional adjustments, regional transmission charge to pay for transmission facilities. And so as I make that comparison to the complexity of the electric tariffs compared to the simplicity of what we have here, I guess I'm astounded that we don't have greater challenges facing us than what is apparent to us. I guess the whole point of this is really to make sure that we are paying for the infrastructure to deliver, as well as then, in this case, I was going to say the sewage flow is the product, but it doesn't quite fit in that descriptor. But we have to pay for the flow to have it processed. So I guess, you know, are there other variables that are analogs to electric tariffs? I mentioned transmission charges. Are there other variables that we need to be longer term thinking of that have influence on the costs that we incur to have our sewage processed? And I think some of the sewage treatment plant upgrades are one of those variable charges. So anyway, I'm not really wanting an answer. I guess it's just electric tariffs have, I think, some measure are informative for our consideration as we think about setting our rates. Anyway, I rambled. I'm sorry.
Councilmember Harper, I think you're spot on there. And look, I think staff can be the first to joke with you. The banker comes in, the first thing he wants to do is raise your fixed charges. So obviously that's the easy setting, because the more fixed charges, the easier to pay for fixed expenditures that are there. And I do think as we become the more capital intensive system, that's definitely a place where emphasis needs to be for exactly what you're saying. To change that into the water side, and you've got water experts here, it's easier to think about water than sewer on this one. So if you don't use a drop of water, the city already has to provide the infrastructure and ability for services before you even turn on the tap. Not one drop of water goes by, but the access for you is there. And we need to be thoughtful about that. So I went back to slide 7 and talked about the elements in that process. Well, I didn't mean to skim over it per se, but cost of service is an element to this. We've talked about revenue requirements, and to Councilmember Jensen's point, we'll show where that is for fiscal 23 as the rate making decision. But over the long term, I think we want to be thoughtful about exactly the kind of cost recovery you're talking about. The city's going to be on the hook to make those infrastructure payments, whether it's pay as you go or debt service, regardless if people are using water, in this case, water use that's billed for sewer. And we do want to keep that in mind. And that's part of the planning tool that we're working on today.
Councilmember Sternad, we haven't heard from you. Do you have any questions or comments?
I do. Thank you, Mayor. I just have a general quick question. Could somebody answer for me? On the residential side, we have peak and off-peak charges on the electrical side. Does the city or the municipality have those same peak charges for producing the water and delivering the water? Obviously, the pumps would be running at more peak times to produce that water. I'm just curious to know if we're incurring additional charges that aren't being transparent in our charges back out to the consumers.
Yes, those peak charges are just rounded into an average month. We pump roughly the same amount throughout the year, higher more than in the summer, unless it's a wet summer. Through the winter, they're pretty consistent. But my electric bill for Alliant during the winter is $25,000 to $28,000 a month. That's pretty consistent. Through the summer, it varies. If it's wet or dry, it'll be up to $40,000 a month for my monthly electric bill for my different plants. REC is a little more better. Maybe I shouldn't put a plug in, but if I have a plant that is, talking back to Grant's fixed charges, if I have an Alliant booster station that is dark, like I do now at 31st Street, we're not pumping any water out there. It's still over $4,000 a month just to have a light bulb on in there. REC is about $1,800 up at my Echo Hill site plant. So those fixed charges are how Alliant is really generating revenue based on peak demands that are set through June, July, and August is where they set that rate for the entire year based on last year's previous electric bill and peak usage.
So you are on a demand billing rate structure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There's peak. So we try to pump water off peak, but demand is demand. So we got to pump during high demand time too, or peak demand time too. But we try to rotate and fill all the tanks at night and have everything filled, ready to roll in the morning so we can avoid the peak time demand. But sometimes demand is demand and you need the water. So they don't like it when I run the generators.
Ryan, you have something you wanted to add to this, and then Steve has another thing.
I wanted to jump back to Councilman Harper's question, because you were talking about the transmission and just, there's this other aspect of it. When we look at the rate structure, Michael's talked about it. We want to be fair. We want to be equitable. We want to make sure that those that are using the system are paying for the system, that we're taking care of it. And when we look at alternative, how do you, the fee structure is complicated. So you can have the fixed, you can have the flow. So, but then we talk about connection fees and and this goes back to Councilperson Mentzer's question about, is growth good? Well, growth is good because you're adding users to the system if we've got the mechanism for them to access the system. So they're buying the rights to the system. So connection fees. So when we talk about growth areas and whose responsibility is to put in the pipe in that growth area, is it the communities, all of us that pay into the system now? Is it the developers that's developing it? They're accessing the system. And so when again, I mean, this is, I think Michael touched on this, or maybe we talked about it as staff were prepping for this, that those are going to be conversations that we can have down the road as we start building this out. So there's going to be a lot more. Again, there's a lot of stuff floating around, and it's going to evolve throughout. And this was the purpose of this, was to have that conversation. There is a strategy. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot to digest. We got to look at the short term, but also realize that there's different strategies that we can deploy and think about and find that happy balance for our community of what's right for the fixed costs, the transmission costs, the access to the system. You guys have anything you want to add?
So just to piggyback off that a little bit, also think of, we'll use the example of the old Y site. So that was a site that had minimal flow at the locker rooms, and then it gets redeveloped into a large multifamily residential area. And so in that case, we made them look at what was the change in flow and how does that impact our system? Because when you change densities like that, you affect the system. So that's going to also be a discussion that we're going to be bringing to city council as to how do you want to deal with that? So if somebody comes in, say in the uptown, and adds much more density, should they pay for the issues that they're causing in our system downstream? So there's a lot of moving parts to this, so.
Steve.
Yeah, the one thing I wanted to be clear on is the request, because your slide 27 showed this $6 rate increase under the sewer variable charge. Most of the discussion has been talking about that. Obviously, we're talking about the need to be funding the investment in the long-term infrastructure, and that really relates more to a fixed charge. So is the request that you're going to come to us with really going to be on the fixed charge side or the variable?
To clarify, it's 2.6 from 439. So that would be $1.61 increase on the variable charge, not a $6 increase. But yes.
Oh, no, I understand that.
Yeah,
2.6, yeah.
Yeah.
$2.6, but
clear. Yep. And then on that, we've talked with staff a little bit about that. And I think we know where we're headed with some of the capital investment that we're going to need to make. There will need to be more emphasis in the future on those fixed charges. Because we're still working through the timing and implementation of those, I think the potential movement on fixed charges may better align with the time for additional fixed costs on the system. We can add in that. There's different theories of the case here. I think it's reasonable to consider multiple options there, but the staff and our feedback was we thought this would be appropriate in line with what has been done over the last few years in terms of where the increases have been. But our head is definitely going in that direction over the mid to long term.
so as you work on projections, then we would anticipate, as you roll out different projections and funding alternatives,
Yep.
that more of that will equate to an increase in the fixed charge to satisfy the immediate need because of our problem with not enough revenue. It's recommended to come as part of the variable charge for fiscal year 23.
I think that's appropriate.
Okay, I
Yeah.
want to make sure we were clear on that.
I don't think there's a magic answer on what that fixed versus variable balance needs to
Okay.
be yet.
Yeah, okay.
All right, we'll continue those conversations with council over the next year, 2, 3, as we dive into the strategy.
And just one more clarification, March 1st, they had another sewer rate increase, so it's 460 right now instead of the 439.
439, sure, yeah.
Just
Great. Great.
Okay.
Sarah and then Grant.
So is there I know every community is different, and growing communities versus kind of stagnant in population growth, those that are completely surrounded versus us who can go a long ways out into
Mhm.
other areas. Is there a best practices that's seen, or communities that have really been able to manage a balance with this? Or is it because this is just one component to fees in a community? So maybe you're average here, but you're high somewhere else, or you're low somewhere else, and all balances out in, never getting too skewed high, which kind of comes to my other question. When we're looking at those comparisons,
Mhm.
is it communities that are putting these together the same way that we are? Whether it's grants, whether it's this, are the communities that, we're low in certain areas? Is it because we've been able to find grant and other federal funding that has made us not have to have higher rates? Like, when we're looking at those comparisons, are we really comparing apples to apples in how those communities are charging those fees, or where they're getting their revenues to pay for the different projects, et cetera? Probably too deep for today's meeting. That's okay. That's brief summary sometime is fine. And then my second question, semi-related, is unlike other utilities, then are we restricted? Are there rules or areas that we can't get up to certain things, or we can't throw a rate up too high, or we have to function within certain parameters in order to meet these different needs? Like, we can't, not that we're going to go charging a whole bunch, but what if you had a rogue thing that said, yeah, we're just going to go out and we're going to, lay this sewer line all the way out. It's going to cost this much, and gosh, residents, for this little bit of time, you're going to pay for that, but it's going to be better for you 20 years from now. Could somebody say, oh, no, that's not a legal increase?
Those are great questions. I'm going to do the second one first.
He's going to punt it to Ryan.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So this on the second item, under the way the state of Iowa is governed, you don't have oversight by any additional board on top of you, like the Iowa Utilities Board or anything like that. The folks on council are the sole decision makers of setting policy and rates and charges for the system. So that there's not a limit necessarily there from that standpoint. I'll start on one and then you jump. Okay, you start on one and there you go.
Just as somebody that is fairly new to our community, from a best practice standpoint, I think, I don't think I know, because this is what Michael and I actually worked together on implementing in Indianola. And I think in a lot of respects, Marion's ahead of the curve with respect to the HDR study, understanding, looking at it, and prioritizing and planning. So from a best practice standpoint, this is the fun stuff. I know it doesn't seem fun. There's a lot of moving parts. It is complex and complicated, and nobody likes talking about rate adjustments, but it is a necessity. So I would say, to your question about are there best practices, I think we're living it. I think Marion is living it right now, taking a look at the infrastructure, understanding that's an important thing to do, taking the time to really understand a strategy, have conversations like this, and let's make sure that we're putting together a pro forma so you can have these informed decisions. Because that then gets to kind of the question that Michael answered, is being able to go back to the community from a transparency standpoint and say, here's our strategic plan. This is what we've been charged to do. You've been elected to do this. We're using data to help drive these decisions. And then you're kind of telling us how fast or how slow we're going based on what you're hearing from your constituents. The apples to apples question, it's most likely not going to be apples to apples, because there's going to be, there are going to be communities in there that have their own sewer system. So there's going to be different costs. If you treat and transport, we just transport, we pay somebody else to treat. We are getting a charge. So it would kind of equalize out, but there's all sorts of different factors. Just from the central area, a lot of communities in the metro belong to the WRA,
Wastewater Reclamation Authority.
Thank you. But they all pay in and their rates are all going to be dependent on their access to the system. When did they buy to the system? How far are they from? How far does that infrastructure have to go? So those costs are not going to be apples to how we are. However, we as a society, whenever we're looking at costs, we always want to kind of have that comparison. How are we doing compared to others? And a lot of times the comparisons aren't always apples to apples. Property taxes are a good example. Rates, because we have our different circumstances. We have a different condition of our systems in a different condition than a lot of others that are paying into it. So there's all sorts of different factors that it's not as simple as that, but it does give us, it is a data point that helps all of us look at it, make some informed decisions. And what is the appetite?
And I think in the past, even if staff knew we needed increases or large, I think what they kind of made recommendations as to what they thought the council had appetite for. And the decisions were made based on what does the community's appetite, or how's that going to be perceived, where like, this is so helpful, because I think we're finally getting to a point where we're making decisions based on facts and data, and it's explainable. It is what it is. The facts are the facts. And ultimately, we just want to be able to show how we got to this decision. And people, the majority of people, reasonable people, support decisions that seem to based in data and facts and on reasonable decision making and on logical decision making. I think people can come to the same conclusion, that this is a reasonable decision and here's how we got there based on facts and data. We're not making decisions in a vacuum, or well, we don't think the community is going to like that. I think this is tremendous progress for us as a city, and I'm just really pleased with this process. And and we all end up better for it, I think. So Grant had something, and then we'll come back to Colette. Yep.
An extension of what you were just describing, Marion, in terms of, within our comparison group, that 42 or 43 communities, there's systemic, financial, technical variability that, kind of doesn't lend itself to direct comparison. But I think on a population basis, it's kind of interesting in that you can draw at least, are you in line or are you out of line, right? Even though one-on-one comparison might not be appropriate. So in that vein, I guess I do have one last question, and this is, you just served cake. This question would be icing on the cake, and only if you have time to prepare it. I think it would be an interesting data point to see across that comparability group, kind of what the fixed monthly charges are, if they have any that are available that we could see.
That's the 0 cubic feet effectively. That's quantified on there. So
thank
that's
you.
basically no usage. So a proxy for just either availability charge, fixed monthly charge, capital charge, or the collection of those various charges depending on the community.
Well, thank you. Okay.
Ryan,
Icing's there.
do you guys have a copy of that report, by the way?
You have it?
Yeah, we'll get that.
I know Ryan shared it in a presentation before.
Yeah, we have it. We can share it with council if you
Yeah.
like.
Great, thank you.
All right, Councilmember Atkins.
Senator Grant.
I would not call this cake and icing, but I appreciate the emphasis. You know what comes to mind? Just a question, but I want to make sure that first I understand something accurately. So what you've presented here, this slide, is how it would compare based on the data from today. So likely that green would be maybe even lower because it would be based on, there would be increases in other communities that we just don't know what they are, right?
I think that's the theory of the case.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Then on to my question, which is, I understand that we're proposing to increase, right, overall the charge per resident of about $1.60 for FY '23. And that we need to come up with a long-term plan for the next 10 years. When are we gonna put together that long-term plan, right? So we know what we're gonna do this next year, but then at what point will we say, okay, here is what we propose you do for the next 7 to 10 years based on the information that we've collected?
So that does kind of go back to that budget calendar that Ryan was talking about. We are actively working on that budget calendar, and we also have to consider that this is just one piece of that big overall budget. So it will take time to create the full 5-year, and we need to get aligned to make sure we have that full picture. But that budget calendar will be coming forth to you. And then in probably May or June.
So in May or June, we would have a budget calendar in which we would be looking at a 5-year forecast, not a 7 to 10-year forecast.
The budget calendar will set out all the milestones that we will have over the next year as we develop the budget.
Okay.
And so something like this would be, we've already started building it. This is part of that process. And we will continue to build that, and we will continue to review that every year as part of the budget process.
So I understand
Okay.
what you're saying, but part of that budget process, in order to make a good review and a decision, we need to know what should we do in order to make sure we are catching up and providing good, solid foundation for this work for the next 10 years, right? So I understand the idea, you work on it on a yearly basis, but in order to do that budgeting on a yearly basis, you have to understand what's the end game here. And that's what I'm asking is, will we have that end game to sort of start to figure out, okay, fiscal year 24, we're going to chunk it out here. 25, we're doing here, 26, we're doing here, so on and so forth.
And that's where we'll take, if I'm understanding your question, and if I don't, please correct me, but that's where, as part of the budget calendar, the budget process, we're going to also have the CIP process built into it. And that's where, as part of the CIP process, we're going to be taking that HDR, all these 3-letter, the engineering study that has identified all the things that we should be doing, the $83 million. We're going to be working and pulling those out and plugging them into the long-term CIP, working with Michael on, as we're building that, continue to populate these numbers. So it's going to be something that we'll never, ever, ever be able to be completely done with.
Sure.
But it's going to be, we're just gonna continue to build on whatever we have, and it's gonna be fluid. It's gonna be coming through the CIP. Dissecting that is gonna be an important part of that process.
And my quick answer was going to be, I know what you're really looking for is, when is that final document going to be done? And what I was trying to reiterate when I was mentioning the budget calendar is that you're going to see pieces of it trickle through. So like, Steve, you had asked, when can we see the numbers? We'll be working with Mike Maloney, but when we bring a rate increase to you, I would imagine that in that we will provide you that 5-year projection that we have today. And that 5-year projection will continue to be built on as we get clarity on all these other pieces we've talked about. And so we're talking about that today specifically with sanitary sewer, but we also need to do that with the other utilities and with the general fund. So what I'm trying to say is, you will see pieces of it throughout
Thank you.
as we build.
Got it. Thank you.
That answer your question?
It does.
But on the near term, talking about those projections, I mean, we're going to be voting on this $6 rate increase next month.
Correct. And so we
Because
would
you
be
need 3
sharing
readings,
that
and if
with
this
you
is in effect
between.
July 1st, we got to be
Correct.
jumping on that probably in our first meeting in May then.
Yes,
So those projections then will be part of that.
yes.
They'll be available before we have. our
And
first
that's the
vote.
current projection that we have now, knowing that as we get clarity on things, those projections over time will change.
Oh, I understand that. Okay.
Thanks, Craig. Because the meeting is recorded, correct? Yeah, okay, thanks. Go ahead.
Craig Adamson, Public Services Board. Thanks for inviting me to your pipe dream session. So Just a couple of comments as I was listening to the presentation. First off, I just want to preface this by thanking each of you for agreeing to be on the council and getting yourselves elected. It's a hard job, and I just appreciate the fact that we seem to have a group that takes this very seriously and is asking a lot of proactive questions. That wasn't always the case when I was on the council, so thank you for that. Just ideas that either I would like to make sure staff is thinking about or this council is thinking about related to us being 32 out of 42 in our peers. How many of those 32 of the 42, and it kind of was actually alluded to a little bit ago, have their own system, or how many of those groups are piggybacking on a system like we are? So of the 10 that are below us, is that Bettendorf? Is that Muscatine? Is that Sioux City? I don't know what those communities are, but that would be, I think, helpful to understand what decisions they've made and then use that as some guidance for us, and then kind of playing that out, knowing that these are our peers and that they are managed, especially the ones that are managing their own sewer system if we end up going that direction. What are their construction cost overruns? What are their maintenance cost overruns? What are their replacement cost overruns? Obviously, everybody's dealing with inflation and all of those things, but whether we stay with the current system or we go a different direction, just looking at what those other communities have done and can we learn from their mistakes. And I'm assuming from a peer standpoint, you're in contact with public services directors, city engineers, finance people, whatever that would be. Just comparing notes, what would we do different, knowing what we know now? And can we speed up our learning based on what those mistakes have been? So just asking for everybody to keep those things as a part of this discussion so we can make the best decisions with their tax dollars as possible. So thank you.
Thanks, Craig.
I'm going to piggyback off of what Craig is talking about. So he talked about, let's look at the difference of who has their own system and who's piggybacking like we are. Has there ever been a study done about what the difference would be of the cost to a city to have their own versus piggybacking? Is there any study ever done to somehow quantify that?
That is normally, if there is, it's normally done by the city itself.
Okay.
We did one in Indianola. When I left, we were 50% through construction of a $50 million wastewater treatment plant. As part of that, we looked at siting, what was the cost? We looked at and evaluated connecting to the regional wastewater agency in Des Moines. And Michael was instrumental in that and did the cost comparison and provided that data for the council. And the decision was to proceed with this state-of-the-art wastewater treatment plant.
Oh, really?
The community had one that was over 40 years old, was being held together by duct tape and bubble gum. And then the nutrient reduction strategy that Michael alluded to earlier, that was an upgrade that was going to have to take place, that all large facilities are going to have to do. And actually we financed most of it with SRF, and then it was a sponsored project and received a couple $1 million to reinvest back in stormwater. But that's an effort that each community would have to go through.
I understand. Okay, thanks.
Okay. Go ahead.
Is that going to be part of the long-term? What you're going to look at for the long-term solution?
That is not on staff's, that has not been directed by staff. That's a decision that council will need to make at some point. I think as we continue our conversations with Cedar Rapids, which commence tomorrow, I mean, the data is the data, and that's certainly an option that will be available to council. Staff's not advocating one way or another. We got to see what transpires and what the cost of service is, and what's the appetite for council.
Anything else? Does that bring us to the conclusion or is there anything else?
Yeah, no, that's it. We will get you, I just asked Michael if he can, how quickly he can update that. So we'll be able to get that to you quickly. Do you think we'll be able to have it at least for presentation? Present the different option or the updated scenario for council on May 3rd? I don't want to put you on the spot.
I think that's consistent with our assumptions before tonight's meeting. So, yeah.
So,
Well, you're all doing really great work and I really appreciate it. I think I made no secret that I feel like, having a roadmap, knowing where we're going, making informed decision-making is just critical and part of our growing up as a city. And I think we're definitely headed in that direction. And this is an important step. So thank you so much for all your work. Anything else to add? Okay, we're adjourned. Thank you.